Today, we're digging into a really controversial 1954 text by Benjamin Friedman called Facts Are Facts. Now, our goal here isn't to debate or validate any of its claims. We're simply here to walk through the author's arguments using his own logic as our guide. So let's just dive right in. So, this is the big one. Right at the heart of the entire text is this really provocative thesis. Friedman's whole case starts with the argument that the people we know as Ashkenazi Jews are not, in fact, descended from the ancient peoples of Judea. Everything else he says really spins out from this single core idea. So how in the world does he get to that conclusion? Well, Friedman builds his argument in three main parts. First, there's a linguistic claim about the word Jew itself. Then there's a historical narrative about a lost kingdom. And finally, a theological interpretation of the Talmud. We're going to walk through each piece of his argument step by step, exactly as he lays it out. Okay, so the first pillar of Friedman's argument is all about language. He claims that our modern understanding of the word Jew is actually based on a huge historical and translational mistake. Friedman's argument starts with this timeline. He says that the word Jew is way more modern than most people think. According to his research, the term came from the 4th century Latin Judaeus. Then it morphed into early English words like Iwi, and finally it only showed up in its current form, Jew, in the 18th century. And this is where he really draws a line in the sand. For Friedman, the distinction between these two words is absolutely critical. He argues that Judean was the correct historical term, and it was just a geographic label, kind of like saying someone's a Californian. In contrast, he claims the word Jew is a modern corruption that was basically invented to create a false racial and religious link to ancient Judea. All right, let's shift gears from linguistics and jump into the historical part of his argument. This is where Friedman presents what he claims is the real origin story for most of today's Ashkenazi Jews, and it's the story of the Khazar kingdom. So the text describes this huge, powerful kingdom in Eastern Europe called Khazaria, and Friedman is very specific here. He identifies the Khazars not as a Semitic people from the Middle East, but as a Turco-Finnish or Asiatic nation that had migrated into Europe from Asia. So the story he tells goes like this. Back in the 7th century, the pagan king of the Khazars, a ruler named Balan, decides his people need a new faith. Friedman writes that King Balan looked at Christianity, looked at Islam, and rejected both. Instead, he made this huge decision to convert his entire nation to the religion he calls Talmudism, which, of course, we know today as Judaism. And this is the absolute linchpin of his historical argument. Friedman's conclusion is that the ancestry of Eastern European Jews doesn't trace back to Palestine at all. Instead, it goes directly to these converted Khazars, making them, in his view, a European people with no ancestral ties to the Holy Land. Okay, so we've had language and we've had history. That brings us to the third and final part of Friedman's case, his theological arguments. And here, he really zooms in on his interpretation of the Talmud and one specific, pretty controversial prayer. First off, Friedman makes a key distinction. He claims the religion of Judea back in Jesus' time wasn't what we call Judaism today. He says it was a practice called Pharisaism, and he presents it as a religion based not so much on the Bible, but on that collection of writings known as the Talmud. And the text goes on to argue that this tradition continues today, with the Talmud acting as the main legal and ethical code of modern Judaism. He positions it as the ultimate authority, a kind of rulebook for religious life. To support his claims about the Talmud's influence, Friedman focuses really intensely on the Kol Nidre prayer. This declaration, which we've quoted directly from his source, is all about vows and oaths. And it's a big deal. It's recited every year on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. So here's the crucial part, his interpretation. Friedman argues that this prayer is not about repenting for vows you've already broken. He claims it's what he calls a law of revocation in advance. In his view, it prospectively cancels out any oath or pledge a person might make in the next year, basically giving them a kind of preemptive pass. And finally, Friedman pulls all of these different threads, the linguistic, the historical, and the theological, together into one single overarching claim, that this entire history of the Khazars has been deliberately hidden from the world. So the natural question is, why? Why would this history be concealed? Well, according to Friedman, the motivations are threefold. First, for political and economic advantage. Second, to use a manufactured link to ancient Judea to legitimize modern geopolitical claims. And finally, he alleges the ultimate goal is to dilute and undermine the Christian faith. And there you have it, That's the argument, from start to finish as it's laid out in Benjamin Friedman's 1954 text. By presenting his claims just as he made them, we're really left with a much broader question, one that goes far beyond this one document. How do contested histories and origin stories, whether this one or any other, end up shaping the identities and conflicts of today?